In today's video, I'm going to be ranking all 11 units of AP Precalculus on a tier list from the most important units to the most garbage units. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. For a quick note, these rankings are very subjective to my opinion, so please don't get offended by these rankings. If you think that one unit is better than the other or should be ranked higher, put it down in the comment section down below, or join the Discord server where you can talk with the community and discuss your ideas.
Perfect.
Yes. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start off with conic sections. I feel like conic sections are important. Actually, no, I don't think they're very important, actually. I think that you don't really need to know them for calculus, but I think if you go into multivariable calculus, you will need to know conic sections. Personally, I kind of forgot conic sections, so honestly, I'm going to probably rank this in somewhat useful. I feel like it does serve a purpose, and it is like AP level, but it's not really useful, I would say. So I'm going to put that in somewhat useful. Next, we have polar coordinates, complex numbers, and polar equation graphs. So this was towards the end of precalculus. I would say this unit is also somewhat useful. The reason I say this is because you do have to use certain formulas, and I feel like your problem solving skills get way better through this unit. If it didn't have that, I would probably rank it lower, but since it does have that complexity point to it, I would say it's somewhat useful in terms of tuning your mathematics skills. Okay, so next we have vectors, and honestly, I think vectors are, I would say, very important, honestly, because vectors I feel like you build off of in calculus, and you also build off of them in AP Physics, because right now I'm using vectors in AP Physics. I'm not using it to the extent I used it in pre-calc, but I still think it's a very important unit that you should actually try to remember and learn. So yeah, I would say that's one of the most important units in pre-calculus. Next, we have solving trigonometric equations. That's a good one. So the thing about solving trigonometric equations, and I think it might be called something different in terms of other schools, but what I meant by this is like the double angle and the half angle identities. And I would say this is actually a decent unit. The reason I say this is because in calculus and sometimes in physics, you will have to use like sine 2 theta or theta over 2, maybe in a certain formula. I remember I was watching physics videos today, and they had that in one of the equations. So I would say it is useful to an extent, but it's also very you have to remember so many formulas. It's confusing and too much work. So that's why I ranked it in decent. Next, we have exponential and logarithmic functions. Obviously, this is going to be S tier. This is going to be one of the most important units in precalculus. Why? Because exponential and logarithmic functions you need to know throughout, you learned in algebra 2 and you learned it in pre-calc. You learned it, you're going to learn it in calc, and you're going to keep on going probably. So I would say it is very, very useful. You need to understand exponential and logarithmic functions. Graphing them, not really, but on exams, they're going to throw in a log question or an exponential question to throw you off, especially with derivatives. This is what we're learning right now in calculus. So I would say it's a pretty decent and useful unit of AP Precalculus. Next, we have graphing trigonometric functions. That's a good unit. I would say this one would be... I would say this is actually decent. I wouldn't say it's important for one reason, and one reason only is because you really don't need to know how to graph trigonometric functions after precalculus. I don't think you do. You just need to know how they work, like how they oscillate, or the domain and range of them, or what they look like, stuff like that, or like the horizontal and vertical asymptotes. You don't need to specifically know how to graph them after precalculus. Obviously, in AP Precalculus, they're going to make you graph it, but I would say it's somewhat useful to an extent, but in calculus, we've been talking about sine graphs and the domain and range and squeeze theorem and stuff like that. But yeah, I would say it's decent, but I wouldn't say it's super duper important, because at the end of the day, you really don't need to know how to graph trigonometric functions, but rather how they work and so forth. Next, we have trigonometry. Obviously, this is going to be an S tier. Trigonometry is so important. I don't know how much I have to stress it. When I say trigonometry, I mean like sine, cosine, right angles, stuff like that. You do learn that in pre-calc, and I feel like it is somewhat important. It's very important. And as you go into physics and as you go into calculus, you will need to know how to do trig, like sine of theta, inverse sine, arc sine, whatever. You need to know all of that. So I would say it is a very, very, very important unit. Make sure you pay attention when you're doing that unit. Next, we have power and radical functions. Okay, so when I say power and radical functions, I mean like graphing them. So I wouldn't say this is like basically useless, honestly, because you don't really need to know how to graph power and radical functions after that unit in pre-calc, unless that's like a comprehension question, because to be honest, it's really not that important. I mean, I haven't been using power and radical functions for a long, long time, ever since pre-calc. Maybe radicals, but that doesn't really fall into that unit. So I would say it's pretty useless. You don't really need to know how to graph them in the future. So yeah, I would say it's somewhat useless. Next, we have limits. Limits is obviously going to go into S tier. Limits are so important. I don't know how much I need to stress how important limits are. This is like the unit towards the end of pre-calculus. You need to know how to find the limit of something. Also, limits, the unit limits also includes derivatives, I'm pretty sure. And the first unit of calculus is literally just limits and derivatives. So this would be like at the top of the top. Sadly, I don't have a tier above this, but I would say, yeah, this is a very, very, very important unit in pre-calculus, and you really, really need to know it, especially if you want to take calculus in the future. So next we have functions. And when I mean functions, I mean like graphing functions, like polynomial functions and so forth. I would say this is somewhat useful. Actually, no, I would say this is decently useful. The reason I say this is because you do need to know how to graph polynomials and lines, because like that's so obvious. But also in calculus, we had like a question where you had to graph a function with like a radical on the bottom. So they're going to throw you some really weird looking functions that you need to graph. So I would say it's a skill you need to know, but it's not so important that like you need to know it all day, every day, 24/7. But I feel like it's just muscle memory. Like, you know how cubic functions look, you know how square root functions look. It's just pure memorization, in my opinion. Last but not least, we have sequences and series. And I know there's a lot of you guys out there that love geometry and the logistics of mathematics, but I'm going to put this in garbage. Honestly, I hate sequences and series. I don't know how much I need to stress how much I dislike sequences and series. They're so confusing, especially telescopic. I think that's what they're called. Telescopic sequences or series or whatever. They're so confusing. So I would say that it's a garbage unit because you don't really expand on it in pre-calculus after you learn it. Like, you just learn it and then that's it. Maybe they'll throw it as a review question, but other than that, you really don't need to know it at all. And in calculus right now, I literally haven't had to use it at all. The only thing I know is arithmetic and geometric. Like, I forgot that entire unit. So I'm not saying don't pay attention and don't care about the unit, but I would just say it really doesn't serve a purpose in the future. Unless you go into, I don't know, linear algebra or something, maybe then you'd have to know it. I feel like it's semi-important, but it's so repetitive and it's so redundant that it just drops it all the way down to garbage tier. So what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with this list? Let me know in the comment sections down below if you guys think any of these should be ranked lower or higher. But if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and also check out my other videos and join the Discord server, which is linked in the description down below, so we can discuss the tier list in depth if you'd like. And I'll see you guys in the next video.